So what I had to do, guys, because it was taking forever to load to YouTube, so that I can put it on the Ed Puzzle stuff, was I had to break it up into two pieces. So following the Crittenden Compromise, right, which again was an attempt to avoid, right, in the spirit of Henry Clay, attempt to avoid a civil war, following the Crittenden Compromise, because the South still seceded, because there was no compromise. One of the things that the Southern states decided to start doing, the Confederate states, I should say, started doing, was seizing all Union property. So anything that they felt was, so think about it like if California seceded from the Union, right? Anything that would be Union property. So let's just say, for example, the post offices. California would take over all the post offices, right? Any type of military base, anything like that. And so the Southern Confederate states, they began to seize these federal areas. One of the areas that they wanted to take, because it leads into Charleston Harbor, as you can see in the blue in the map, is Fort Sumter. So in April of 1861, the South, like I said, was taking control of everything. So the attack on Fort Sumter is considered the first shots of the Civil War. And so what ends up happening was that Jefferson Davis ordered the Southern troops to take the fort, and so the Confederate Army told the Union garrison that was holding the fort that they had either, they were either going to surrender the fort, right, or they were going to fight and possibly die. And so Abraham Lincoln ordered the troops inside of Fort Sumter to hold steady, and so Jefferson Davis basically left Lincoln with a really interesting decision to make, right? So Lincoln could either send troops in, right? So if he sent troops in, it would look like Lincoln was reinforcing the fort, which meant that Lincoln wanted to attack, which makes Lincoln look like the aggressor, and so Lincoln didn't want to do that. However, if Lincoln didn't do anything, then it would make Lincoln look really weak, and he didn't want to do that either. And so when we look at what happened, Lincoln made a really interesting decision. And his decision was to simply send troops into Fort Sumter, or excuse me, to send supplies into Fort Sumter. So by sending supplies in, he wasn't reinforcing the fort, but he also wasn't not doing anything. And so what it did is it actually put the decision back into Jefferson Davis's hands, and Jefferson Davis decided that he was going to attack the fort, which makes it look like he started the actual attacks. So Lincoln, as a result, called on 75,000 troops to get ready to invade the South. Virginia, Tennessee, Kentucky, and Arkansas joined the Confederacy as a result. Lincoln actually asked Robert E. Lee to lead the Union Army, but because he was from Virginia, he decided that he was not going to. In class, I'll show you a scene from Gods and Generals where this happens. One of the things that Lincoln did also is he called for the suspension of habeas corpus. So in the Constitution, right, again, you are innocent until proven guilty, but because we were in a state of war, Abraham Lincoln decided that it was necessary and proper, right, similar to like the Alien and Sedition Acts, that it was necessary and proper to bend the Constitution. So again, kind of interpreting it in a strict, in a loose way. So he made an executive decision, which allows him to kind of go to bypass Congress. So the ex Pi Merriman, one of the things that we'll talk about is a Maryland case of John Merriman, in which it dealt with the suspension of the writ of habeas corpus. So one of the things that almost got England into the war is something called the Trent Incident. So in 1861, a Union warship was stopped by a British ship on the way to England carrying 2 Confederate diplomats. Lincoln declared that the captain of the ship had acted without orders, and so he was able to avoid war with England. Again, we'll talk a little bit more in class. There was also the Alabama Incident. The British manufactured Confederate ship. It captured over 60 American ships. The U.S. billed England for the damages. England ended up paying $15.5 million in 1872, but again, because of this one ship, almost got involved also. Then in 1863, as a result of the fact that many more young men were needed for the war, the draft began, and so they began drafting young men. And the Irish, specifically in New York, they put aside their nativist differences. And they decided to get together, and there were these huge draft riots. They didn't want to fight a war to free these slaves. 1863, one of the things that we'll also see, because the Democrats were not there and the Congress is controlled by Republicans, is they established the national banking system of 1863, and so criteria by which a bank could obtain federal charter and issue bank notes. And again, it's because the Democrats weren't there, right? So the Republicans were able to bend the Constitution, and so this will eventually lead to the national banking system that we see in 1913. One of the things that also was able to be ratified because the Democrats were gone was the 1862 Homestead Act. Embodied the Republican Party ideal of free soil, granted 160 acres of public land to settlers after 5 years of residence on the land. So the idea was free soil for free people. We'll see lots of different people emerge as heroes during this war. One of them is Clara Barton. She was a reformer and nurse. She was the founder of the American Red Cross in the 1880s, organized nurse care for Union soldiers during the war. Her nickname was the Angel of the Battlefield. So taking a look at some of the first fighting, so the first bloodshed of the war happened at Bull Run or Manassas Junction. It's the same area. So July 21st, 1861, so first bloodshed of the Civil War, ended up being a Confederate victory. We are introduced to Thomas Stonewall Jackson. He was Robert E. Lee's right-hand man. Resulted in both sides realizing that the war was going to be long. And I'll go through the battles in class too. General George McClellan, he was a Civil War general, master organizer, and planner. Lincoln, one of the things that we'll see is that Lincoln went through a bunch of generals just to try to figure out which general was the best one. And so one of the things that we'll see is that Lincoln eventually fires him twice. But one of the things that we'll see with him is he's going to be really important because of the Battle of Antietam. So one of the things that the Union will actually organize is a plan to defeat the South. And so it's going to be nicknamed the Anaconda Plan. So the Union plan for defeating the South, basically what they wanted to do is three major things. A, blockade all southern ports. B, split the Union Army in two so they could take the Mississippi, and then they could essentially strangle the South and then eventually take the capital city of Richmond. So after Virginia's secession, Richmond, Virginia became the capital of the South. Like I said, it eventually will be captured in 1865. Then Robert E. Lee went on to the offensive on his way to capturing Washington, D.C. And so overwhelming victory by the South led to the Battle of Antietam. So there was a second battle of Bull Run in which Robert E. Lee, like we said, decided to go on the offensive. So Confederate general who opposed secession but did not believe the Union should be held by force. Robert E. Lee, he was a huge states' rights advocate. Like I said, Lincoln had asked him to take over the Union Army. And then Arlington, Virginia was his home. And then I apologize for the pictures. They didn't come out for some reason. Then, like we said, on his way in September of 1862, I should say, it's the southern invasion of D.C. by Robert E. Lee. Union soldiers had found Lee's battle plans. And again, we will, in class, go through the battles. But I just wanted to give you guys sort of an order, right, of the battles. So Robert E. Lee's plans are found. General McClellan was able to stop Lee. But the mistake that he made is he didn't go after Lee, and so he gets fired. It is the single bloodiest day of the war, 22,000 men up to this point. Lincoln needed a major victory to try to pursue his Emancipation Proclamation, and the Battle of Antietam was just that. So in January of 1863, Lincoln issues the Emancipation Proclamation, which frees the slaves in the Confederate States. He had to be careful not to upset the buffer states, right, which still held slaves. And so the idea was to hurt the South. This is sometimes, unfortunately, connected to the idea that Lincoln freed all the slaves, but he didn't, right? So the 13th Amendment eventually will. Lincoln, like I said, will go through a bunch of different generals. He then went to General A.E. Burnside, Union General, replaced McClellan. He will lose at Fredericksburg, and he is going to be replaced by General Hooker. General Ambrose Burnside was defeated and lost 12,000 men. General Robert E. Lee led the defeat, again at Fredericksburg. As a result of the Battle of Fredericksburg, though, was the Battle of Chancellorsville, Virginia. The Union defeated again, but the South lost General Thomas Jackson to friendly fire. Battle of Gettysburg eventually happens between July 1st and the 3rd of 1863. A large battle in Pennsylvania. General George Meade defeated Robert E. Lee. 50,000 men died and were injured. Considered massive turning point in the war for the North. So one of the things we've been talking about, right, is the fact that Lincoln, it took him a bunch of trial and error to try to find the general that was best, and eventually he came across General Ulysses S. Grant. He became the commanding officer of the Union Army. He accepted the unconditional surrender of Robert E. Lee. Later became the 18th president of the United States. And again, like I said, we'll go through these in class. One of the things that happens for him is the Battle of Shiloh. We almost lost him at the Battle of Shiloh. Confederate forces surprised Union troops, then drove them across the Tennessee River. Grant was able to get the Union victory. It's also considered one of the bloodiest battles of the in the same week that the Battle of Gettysburg took place, Grant was responsible for the Battle of Vicksburg, July of 1863. So he was able to capture the capture of Vicksburg was able to lead the Union to control the Mississippi River. Huge loss for the South. The person that he decided was best to kind of lead also with him was a guy by the name William Tecumseh Sherman. His job was to go into the South and essentially help divide the South, and he was instructed essentially by Grant to do whatever was necessary. So total war. This is known as Sherman's March to the Sea. So he scorched Georgia from Savannah to Atlanta. General Sherman's march from Atlanta to South Carolina in 1865. Scorched the earth policy. Again, total warfare. The idea was to crush the South and make sure that the South would never rise again, according to what he said. Then one of the things that we'll begin to see also is the emergence of, like, in the Union. So some of the Democrats stayed loyal. And so we had what were called the War Democrats. They were the Democrats, like I said, who stayed loyal, and they wanted to continue the war. So there were also Peace Democrats, U.S. Democrats, who didn't support the War of Lincoln and hoped to reunite the states through negotiation. These guys were known as Copperheads because they kept kind of biting at the heels of Lincoln. And then eventually the surrender takes place in April of 1865. The Union treated Lee with respect and allowed Lee and his men to return home to their families. On April 14th, 1861, John Wilkes Booth assassinated Abraham Lincoln at Ford's Theater. He died April 15th, 1865. It ends up being what we call a calamity for the South because they rejoiced when, in fact, Lincoln would have been softer on them. So we said John Wilkes Booth is the guy who assassinates him. So we enter the period known as Reconstruction from 1865 to 1877. We have Congressional Reconstruction versus President Johnson, and then again it raises some